It was Sunday morning in the spring of 1944, and the sun hung over the Georgia pines like a pale coin, shining through the thin mist that rolled off the fields. Inside Camp Gordon, the air was still. German prisoners moved quietly between the barracks, washing tin cups, sweeping dust, and trying not to think too much. The clang of the breakfast bell had faded, leaving only the distant sound of church bells drifting from the nearby town. Most of the men ignored them. Church bells had once meant home, family, and Sundays spent with mothers and sisters and laughter. But here, behind barbed wire, the sound was only a reminder of everything they had lost. Karl Müller sat on the edge of his bunk, buttoning the top of his gray work shirt. He was 24, a former infantry corporal from Bavaria, captured the previous year in Tunisia. The desert had broken him the heat, the dust, the endless retreat. When the Americans finally surrounded their position, he had thrown down his rifle without a word. He'd expected brutality. He'd been told that the Americans would beat prisoners, starve them, and parade them through the streets like animals. Instead, they had given him a blanket, a cigarette, and a cup of hot coffee. It had been the first kindness he'd known in months, and it confused him more than any act of violence could have. Still, Karl never stopped expecting the other shoe to drop. He'd seen enough of war to know that mercy was usually temporary. The guards at Camp Gordon treated them well, but he told himself it was just a tricksome way to keep them calm. Outside, a sergeant shouted orders for the work details. The men lined up automatically. A few would go to the sawmill that day, others to the cotton fields or the nearby rail line. But then something unusual happened. A different voice called out a soft-spoken American with a southern drawl. "Anyone who wishes," the man said, "may attend church this morning. The town pastor has invited you." The line of Germans froze. For a long moment, no one moved or spoke. The idea sounded absurd. Church, outside the camp? Karl looked at the guard's face, expecting sarcasm or a smirk, but there was none. The man simply stood there, holding a clipboard, looking at them as if this were the most ordinary offer in the world. A few men chuckled nervously. Someone muttered under his breath, a trick. But one older prisoner stepped forward, Otto Weber, a quiet man who had once been a schoolteacher near Hamburg. "I will go," he said. His voice was calm, almost defiant. The guard nodded. "Anyone else?" There was silence. Then a few others joined Otto. Karl hesitated. He wasn't sure why, but his chest felt tight. He had grown up in a small church, had sung in a choir as a boy, had prayed to a God who seemed to have vanished in the smoke of war. Now, something in him stirred at the thought of hearing hymns again, even if they came from the enemy's lips. He raised his hand. "Ich auch," he said. "Me too." The guard gave a small smile. "Good service starts in 30 minutes. That morning, 15 German prisoners walked through the open gate under escort. There were no rifles pointed at them, only watchful eyes. The road to town was lined with green fields and flowering dogwood. The smell of fresh earth filled the air. For a moment, Karl forgot that he was a prisoner. When they reached the church, a small white building with a tall steeple, people were already arriving. Families in their Sunday clothes stepped from cars, children holding hymn books. The prisoners stood awkwardly at the edge of the yard, unsure if they should enter. But the pastor, a thin man with silver hair and clear blue eyes, walked over and extended his hand. "You're very welcome here," he said simply. Karl hesitated before shaking it. His palm felt rough, the man's grip firm but gentle. Around them, murmurs rippled through the townspeople. Some looked curious, others uneasy, but no one turned them away. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of pine polish. The pews creaked as they sat down. A few of the locals nodded politely. One old woman even offered a shy smile. The organ began to play. The first hymn was Amazing Grace. Karl didn't know the words, but he understood the melody. It rose and fell like a prayer for all the broken things in the world. He bowed his head, and for the first time in a long time, he felt something close to peace. After the service, the pastor invited everyone outside for refreshments. Tables had been set up under the trees, lined with glasses of lemonade and bottles of Coca-Cola. Children darted between the adults, laughing. One small boy, no more than 8, walked up to Karl and held out a cookie. Karl didn't know what to do. He looked to the guard, who just nodded. "Go ahead," he said softly. Karl accepted it. The boy smiled and ran off. The cookie was sweet, buttery, soft. For a moment he stood there, chewing slowly, wondering how something so simple could make his eyes sting. Another prisoner, Otto, stood beside him. "They treat us like guests," he whispered. "Guests?" Karl nodded slowly. "They must be mad." The guard standing nearby overheard and smiled. "Maybe we are," he said, "but it's Sunday, and on Sundays, everyone deserves grace." That afternoon, when they returned to camp, the other prisoners crowded around them, eager for details. "What was it like?" they asked. "Did they mock you? Did they preach against Germany?" Karl shook his head. "No," he said. "They prayed for peace. For everyone." Someone scoffed. "Peace. From Americans." Karl met his gaze. "Yes," he said quietly. "From Americans." That night, lying on his bunk, Karl couldn't sleep. The memory of the music, the handshake, and the laughter of children replayed in his mind. He reached into his jacket pocket and felt the crumpled paper of a hymn the pastor had given him. "Blessed are the peacemakers." He didn't know it then, but that morning would mark the beginning of his transformation from a soldier who had believed in fear to a man who would one day preach forgiveness. As the camp lights flickered off, the sound of the church bell drifted faintly through the night air again. It was no longer a sound of loss. It was a sound of hope. It began in the desert, months before the church bells of Georgia. The sun above Tunisia was white and merciless, flattening every shadow into dust. For days, the 10th Panzer Division had been retreating east, every mile marked by burning trucks and dead engines. By the time Karl Müller's unit reached the outskirts of Tunis, they were no longer an army, just a scattering of hollow men with rifles and no ammunition. The air smelled of oil, sweat, and fear. German command radioed false orders of counterattacks that never came. Everyone knew the truth. The Afrika Korps was finished. British armor pressed from one side, Americans from the other, and the sea waited ahead. On the morning of May 9th, 1943, Karl awoke to the sound of engines. Dust rose on the horizon, dozens of vehicles, moving fast. He clutched his rifle, but his sergeant was already walking toward the road, waving a white cloth tied to his bayonet. "It's over," the man said quietly. "Better to live as a prisoner than die for a lie." When the first American jeep appeared, Karl expected rough shouts, maybe gunfire. Instead, the jeep slowed, and a young soldier in dusty fatigues raised his hand in greeting. "Put your weapons down, fellas," he called out. "You're done fighting now." The Americans searched them methodically, but not harshly. One soldier handed Karl a canteen. "Water," he said. Karl hesitated, then drank. The water was warm and tasted faintly of metal, but to him, it was the purest thing he'd ever swallowed. Hours later, hundreds of prisoners were assembled in a makeshift holding camp. They sat beneath palm trees, guarded by men who looked barely older than boys. Karl watched as one American passed around cigarettes, lighting each one for the captured Germans as if they were guests. He didn't understand it. Weren't they supposed to hate them? That night, when food came, canned beans, bread, and a slice of peach from a tin, Karl felt the first pang of confusion that would haunt him for years. He wrote in a scrap of paper, torn from a field manual, "The enemy gives us food. They treat our wounds. What kind of war is this?" Days later, trucks arrived to take them to the coast. They were loaded onto Liberty ships, massive, gray, and loud with engines. Karl had heard of them before. German propaganda had mocked these vessels, calling them floating coffins built by amateurs. But standing on the deck, he realized they were miracles of steel. The Americans built them faster than the U-boats could sink them. Below deck, the prisoners slept in rows of bunks, stacked like shelves. It was cramped, but they had clean water, bread, and soup. On the third night, Karl climbed to the upper deck and stared across the sea. Convoys stretched to the horizon, dozens of ships moving in formation, protected by destroyers that flashed signal lamps across the waves. The night sky was clear and endless. Somewhere beyond it was the home he might never see again. The sea breeze smelled of oil and salt and freedom. Beside him, Another prisoner whispered, "Look at it. This is why they'll win. They can build forever." Karl nodded silently. He didn't want to admit it, but part of him already knew it was true. The voyage took nearly 2 weeks. The Americans let them stand on deck during the day, under watch, but not in chains. Some played cards, others just stared at the horizon. The guards seemed almost bored. Once, one of them handed Karl a chocolate bar. "Hershey," the man said with a grin. "Welcome to America." Karl didn't understand the words, but he understood the gesture. When land finally appeared, a smudge of green against the gray sea, the guards told them it was Virginia. Karl had imagined America as a place of skyscrapers and smoke. Instead, the coastline was soft and bright, dotted with white houses and fields. Even from the ship, he could see cars glinting on distant roads, trains moving like insects across the plains. They disembarked at a naval pier, lined with MPs. The air smelled of pine and diesel. Women worked on the docks, hauling crates and waving at the soldiers. A group of children stood at a distance, curious and unafraid. One boy, maybe 10, pointed at Karl's uniform and shouted, "Mama, are those the Nazis?" His mother hushed him gently. The prisoners were loaded onto trains. Through the slats, Karl watched America roll by. Red barns, church steeples, billboards advertising cigarettes and Coca-Cola. Every town seemed untouched by war. Not a single crater, not a burned-out building. It was like another planet. He whispered to the man beside him, "Their sky has no bombers." The man nodded. "Their children sleep." When the train finally stopped, it was near Augusta, Georgia. The air was heavy with the scent of honeysuckle and grass. Camp Gordon lay at the end of a dirt road lined with barbed wire fences, guard towers, and long wooden barracks. Yet somehow, it looked more like a farm than a prison. The Americans led them through the gate in silence. The guards weren't shouting. Some even smiled. One, a tall man with a sunburned neck, called out, "Welcome, boys. Keep it orderly, and we'll all get along." Inside the camp, everything was clean and organized. There were showers, bunks, a mess hall. The food that night, stew, bread, and coffee, was better than anything Karl had eaten since. 1941. The other prisoners murmured in disbelief. One whispered, "They feed us like guests." Another replied, "They feed us so we work harder." Karl wasn't sure. When the lights went out, he lay awake, listening to the distant hum of an American generator. Outside the fence, he could hear crickets and the faint sound of a radio playing swing music. He thought of his mother back in Bavaria, probably queuing for ration bread. He thought of how Germany had promised him glory, and America had given him food. The next morning, they were issued work clothes and told they'd be assigned to farm crews. Karl found himself stepping into open fields under the same sun that had burned him in Tunisia, but this sun felt gentler. The soil was dark and rich. The farmer who met them was named Frank Reynolds, a man with rough hands and tired eyes. Frank pointed toward a plow and said, "You boys know how to handle that." Karl raised a hand cautiously. "A little good," Frank said. "Then you'll do fine. And don't worry, no one's going to shoot you here. Just don't try running. You'd get lost before you get found." The men laughed uneasily, but something in the farmer's tone carried warmth. He treated them like workers, not prisoners. By noon, Karl was drenched in sweat, but strangely content. When the lunch bell rang, Frank's wife brought out sandwiches and cold water. She hesitated before handing a plate to Karl, but then she smiled. "Eat," she said softly. "You look like you need it." He took it with shaking hands. "Danke," he murmured. She didn't understand, but she nodded anyway. That night, as he walked back through the gates, Karl realized something strange. He no longer feared the guards. He feared what this kindness was doing to him, how it was loosening something inside that had been tied in hatred for years. He thought of the American soldier who'd handed him chocolate, the sailor who'd shared a cigarette, the farmer who'd fed him like a friend. And for the first time, he wondered if the real battle wasn't fought with guns at all. It was fought with compassion. That thought stayed with him. Long after the camp fell silent and the crickets took over the night. He didn't yet know it. But soon, that quiet compassion would reach him in an even stranger way through a church. bell, and a handshake on a Sunday morning. The air smelled of cut hay and pine sap when Karl Müller first realized the war was slowly slipping out of him. The weeks after arriving at Camp Gordon had passed in a steady rhythm of work, food, and sleep. Each morning, the guards opened the gates for the work crews. Each evening, they marched them back behind the wire. Nobody shouted. The rules were simple. Obey the guards, work hard, cause no trouble, and you would be treated like a man instead of a number. The farmers who hired the POW laborers were mostly quiet, practical men. They didn't ask about Hitler or the war. They cared only that the cotton was picked, the wheat cut, the fences mended. Frank Reynolds was one of those men. He was built like an ox, with a face browned by sun and wind. When the truck from the camp dropped the prisoners at his farm that first morning, he simply pointed toward the fields. "Get that corner started before noon," he said. Karl had expected scorn, maybe a fist. Instead, he was handed a jug of water and a sandwich. Frank's wife brought it out herself, a woman with tired eyes and a soft voice who moved with quiet grace through the kitchen door. She watched the Germans from the porch as they worked. When one of them stumbled in the heat, she sent her teenage son running with a bucket of water. Karl had never seen anything like it. Back home, foreign laborers had been treated like animals. Here, he was a prisoner, yet he was given shade, water, even conversation. Frank's son, Billy, a thin boy of 15, was curious. During lunch breaks, he'd sit near them, practicing bits of German he'd learned from comic books, Wie geht's, and Dankeschön. The men laughed and replied, correcting his words. By the end of the first week, something resembling friendship had taken root between them. One day, as they loaded hay into a wagon, Frank climbed up beside Karl and said, "You were infantry, right? You fought in Africa." Karl nodded carefully. "Yes, Tunisia." Frank spat over the side of the wagon. "My cousin was with Patton there. Tough fight." He paused, then added, "He said most of your boys fought hard, but you looked tired. Said it wasn't the fight anymore. It was just surviving." Karl didn't know what to say. He thought of the endless sun, the empty canteens, the hopeless orders. Finally, he murmured, "We were already beaten." Frank nodded slowly. "Yeah, war does that. Beats the soul before it beats the body." They worked in silence after that, each man lost in his own thoughts. Back at camp that evening, Karl couldn't shake what Frank had said. He lay on his bunk, staring at the ceiling, the smell of earth and sweat still on his hands. Around him, men murmured quietly, trading cigarettes and talking about home. Someone had received a Red Cross letter his wife and daughter were alive. Others were less lucky. The news from Germany came slowly and carried more sorrow than comfort. Still, life in the camp was better than they dared to imagine. The food was plentiful, the guards respectful. They were even allowed to organize a small orchestra using instruments donated by local churches. When they played in the evenings Beethoven folk songs, even American tunes, the guards gathered outside the fence to listen. It was during one of these concerts that the idea of Sunday service first returned. The camp commandant, a stern but fair officer named Major Davis, had been watching the prisoners closely. He believed that giving them faith would help keep order. One day, he announced that the local pastor had offered to hold joint services open to both Americans and Germans. The idea caused unease among the guards and disbelief among the prisoners. "They want us in their church," one man asked, "after everything we've done." But when Sunday came, curiosity overcame fear. The first group, just a dozen volunteers, was escorted down the dirt road to the small white church. The pastor, a tall man with a gentle face, stood outside waiting. His wife handed out hymn books, and the townspeople watched quietly as the Germans entered. Inside, the air was cool, filled with the smell of polish and lilac. The organ began to play Abide With Me. The Germans didn't know the words, but they recognized the tone, solemn, yearning, tender. Karl felt the music move through him like wind through tall grass. After the service, the pastor spoke in simple phrases, choosing words he knew the prisoners could understand. "We all bleed the same. We all pray to the same God. And when this war ends, may we remember mercy as much as victory." The congregation filed outside into the sunlight. The pastor's wife and several churchwomen had prepared refreshments. There were cookies, lemonade, and bottles of Coca-Cola glistening with condensation. The prisoners hesitated until a young boy walked straight up to one of the motto, the former teacher, and handed him a cookie. The gesture broke the tension. Soon the men were eating, drinking, and awkwardly trying to converse with the townspeople. One woman used gestures to ask about families back in Germany. Another handed out cigarettes. Karl stood beside one of the guards and said, "Why? Why do they do this?" The guard shrugged. "Because it's Sunday," he said. "Because it's right." That night, back in camp, the mood was different. The men were quieter, thoughtful. Otto sat on his bunk, staring at the hymn book he had been allowed to keep. "They prayed for us," he said softly. "Not against us. For us." Karl didn't answer. He was thinking about the pastor's words, about the handshake he'd received from a man who should have hated him. He felt something inside him beginning to shift, something fragile and unfamiliar. Over the following weeks, the invitations continued. Each Sunday, more prisoners volunteered to attend. Some went for curiosity, some for the chance to see the town, others because they wanted to feel human again. The guards noticed the change. The camp grew calmer. Fights stopped. Men who had once cursed the Americans now waved to passing farmers in early summer. Frank Reynolds asked Major Davis for permission to invite his work crew to Sunday dinner. "They've been breaking their backs on my fields," he said. "Least I can do is feed 'em right." The major hesitated, but agreed on one condition: the guards would join them. That Sunday, the prisoners were led to the Reynolds farm. Frank's wife had set a long table under the shade of a pecan tree. Fried chicken, biscuits, mashed potatoes, and corn filled the platters. The smell made the German stomachs twist with hunger and disbelief. Frank clapped Karl on the shoulder. "Sit," he said. "You earned it." They ate together, guards, prisoners, and farmers all at one table. Billy, the farmer's son, sat beside Karl and asked him about Germany. Karl told him about the Alps, the snow, the sound of cowbells in summer. Billy listened wide-eyed. When the meal ended, Frank brought out something else: bowls of vanilla ice cream, the kind made with salt and hand-cranked in a tin bucket. Karl took a spoonful and froze. The cold shocked his tongue. The sweetness lingered. He hadn't tasted ice cream since before the war. For a moment, everything, the fear, the guilt, the endless marching, melted away. He laughed, a deep, surprised laugh that startled even himself. Frank's wife smiled. "Good?" she asked. Karl nodded, still laughing. "Too good," he said. As they walked back to the truck, the prisoners were silent. The road shimmered in the afternoon heat. Finally, Otto said, "Do you think they hate us at all?" Karl looked at him and shook his head. "I don't think they know how." That night, the sound of distant church bells reached the camp again. The men listened from their bunks, the notes drifting softly through the open windows. Somewhere beyond the fence, Americans were sitting down to Sunday supper, children laughing, families praying. And somehow, in a small way, the prisoners felt part of it. Karl lay awake, his mind full of the faces he had seen, the voices that had spoken gently instead of shouting. He thought of the Coca-Cola, the handshake, the pastor's words about mercy. He realized that in this strange place, far from home, he had begun to learn what victory really meant. It wasn't domination. It wasn't fear. It was the power to forgive. And that, he thought, might be the hardest thing of all. By late 1944, the war was nearing its end, though no one in Camp Gordon yet knew how close. The summer fields had turned gold, the air thick with cicadas. For the prisoners, life had settled into a strange rhythm, neither freedom nor captivity, but something suspended between. Each morning, they rode trucks to nearby farms or lumber yards, and each evening they returned dusty and exhausted, but well-fed. They had learned English words, traded jokes with guards, even written letters home under Red Cross supervision. But beneath that quiet routine, something deeper was changing, something Karl Müller felt in his bones. When he'd first arrived in America, he had dreamed constantly of escape, not to run away, but to wake up to find that the farm, the kindness, the music, had all been some fever dream, and that he was still a soldier, still fighting for something that mattered. Yet as months passed, that dream vanished. He found himself dreading the thought of return. He still remembered the first letter that came from Bavaria. The envelope was thin, the handwriting shaky, his mother's. "My dear Karl," it began, "the house still stands, though the windows are gone. We have little food, but we have faith. I pray every night that you are alive. They say our boys fight bravely, but the sky burns every week. Come home when you can. The mountains are still beautiful." He read it under his blanket, the ink blurring as he wept silently. The next morning, he wrote back, "Mother, I am alive. I am in America. The people here are not devils. They feed us. They let us work. Yesterday, I drank something called Coca-Cola. It tastes like happiness and bubbles. I wish you could taste it too." He hesitated before finishing the letter. He wanted to tell her more about the farmers, the music, the church bells, but he feared she wouldn't believe him. In September, the camp orchestra was invited to perform in Augusta's town square for a charity event. Major Davis approved, on the condition that armed guards accompany them. The prisoners arrive in their best uniforms, instruments polished, nervous under the gaze of hundreds of Americans. But as the first notes rose into the warm evening air, a slow, mournful rendition of Silent Night, the crowd grew still. Children sat cross-legged on the grass. Old men removed their hats, and when the last note faded, the applause came like thunder. For the first time, Karl saw Americans and Germans clapping together, the boundaries between enemy and human vanishing like smoke. After the concert, an elderly woman approached him. "You play beautifully," she said. He bowed slightly. "Danke," she smiled, recognizing the word. "My family came from Bremen," she said softly. "Long time ago." She pressed something into his hand, a folded handkerchief embroidered with tiny blue flowers. For luck, Karl kept it tucked in his pocket for years. By winter, rumors spread that the Allies had crossed the Rhine. The guards no longer spoke with confidence about the fighting, they spoke of after. After the surrender, after the war, what would happen then? One evening, while the men played cards in the barracks, Otto approached Karl with a question that hung heavy between them. "What do you think will become of us when it ends?" Karl stared at his hands. "We go home, I suppose." Otto nodded. "And what will we tell them? That we spent the war picking cotton and eating ice cream with Americans." The men nearby laughed softly, but the laughter held unease. They all knew the truth. Their country would not believe what they had seen here. In February 1945, snow dusted the red Georgia soil. Karl was working in the lumber yard when Frank Reynolds drove up in his truck. "War is almost over," he said, shaking his head. "Heard it on the radio? Hitler's cornered." Karl said nothing. He only kept sawing, the rhythm of the blade against the pine log steady and endless. That night, in the mess hall, the gods didn't hide their excitement. Someone shouted, "Berlin's falling." Another laughed, "Won't be long now." But the Germans sat in silence. It was the end of everything, their nation, their pride, their illusions. Karl felt no anger, only a strange emptiness. Weeks later, Major Davis gathered them in the yard. His voice carried over the winter wind. "Germany has surrendered," he said. "The war in Europe is over." There was no cheering, no shouts, just a deep, hollow stillness. Men who had once fought for the Reich stood motionless, eyes lowered. For years, they had imagined that surrender would come with humiliation. Instead, it came with quiet relief. The following months blurred together. The camp's barbed wire remained, but the tension had dissolved. The guards stopped carrying rifles. The men moved freely within the fence, working, reading, playing soccer in the fields. Some began teaching English to others. Karl wrote his mother again. "The war is over. I am safe. America is not what we were told. The people are strong, but kind. They pray even for their enemies. I think I will never forget this place." In late summer, news came that they would be repatriated. The Americans organized trains, ships, paperwork. Farewells were quiet, almost painful. Frank Reynolds came to the camp on their last morning, bringing a small box wrapped in paper. "For you, Karl," he said, handing it over. "You worked harder than any man I've had. Open it later. Karl nodded, unable to speak. The trucks rolled out of Camp Gordon for the last time. The Americans lined the road, waving. Some of the prisoners waved back. Others couldn't bear to look. The ship that carried them home was the same kind of Liberty vessel that had once brought them across the ocean in chains. Now they traveled freely, though the irony was not lost on anyone. When they reached Germany, the shock was immediate. Cities lay in ruins. Smoke still rose from shattered rooftops. The air stank of dust and hunger. At the train station in Munich, crowds of hollow-eyed civilians stared at them as though they were ghosts. Karl made his way back to Bavaria. The village he had left 3 years earlier was barely standing. His mother wept when she saw him. "They said you were dead," she whispered. For days, he walked through the ruins of his old life. The fields were overgrown. The church roof was gone. People spoke in whispers, afraid to say too much. No one mentioned guilt or responsibility, only survival. One afternoon, he sat on the old stone wall outside his family's house, the same wall where he had once carved his initials as a boy. He pulled out the box Frank had given him. Inside was a small photograph, the Reynolds family standing beside their farmhouse, smiling, with a handwritten note on the back. "When you drink your first Coca-Cola back home, think of Georgia." Beneath the photo lay another item, a folded sheet of paper. It was a recipe, written in careful handwriting. Homemade ice cream from Helen Reynolds' kitchen. Karl laughed through his tears. Years later, long after Germany rebuilt and the wounds began to heal, Karl became a teacher, like Otto had once been. Every year, on the anniversary of his capture, he told his students a story they never expected, not about battles or bravery, but about kindness. About the Sunday morning when a group of enemy prisoners were invited to church, about a boy who offered a cookie to a soldier, about a man who had learned that the real victory was not won on battlefields, but in forgiveness and sometimes after class. He would take out the photograph of the Reynolds family and the recipe that had traveled across an ocean and say softly, almost to himself, "They thought we'd starve. Instead, we learned to live."